At
This is
5:30 in the
unacceptable!
morning,
It's
before the sun
unacceptable!
touched
We've
the
been
snow,
stuck here for
my phone exploded
hours!
with messages,
Oh,
threats, and a single order from the HOA that changed everything. They told me my snowplow was banned from their streets, effective immediately, during the worst storm of the year. What followed wasn't revenge, it was consequences. I've plowed these roads for years. Not for praise, not for profit, but because when winter hits hard, neighbors rely on each other. I knew every curve, every blind corner, every driveway where kids waited for the school bus. That morning, the snow fell sideways, thick and relentless, burying streets faster than anyone expected. The HOA president called first. Her voice was clipped, rehearsed, cold. She cited bylaws, liability concerns, and unauthorized equipment. I reminded her we'd agreed years ago, after ambulances couldn't reach the cul-de-sac. She said the board reconsidered. I asked about the storm. She said rules mattered more. I stood in my garage, engine idling, plow blade ready, watching snow pile against the door. I could have ignored them. I could have plowed anyway. Instead, I did exactly what they demanded. I shut the engine off. I walked away. By 8 o'clock, the neighborhood was silent under a white blanket. No tire tracks, no cleared lanes, just untouched snow and rising panic. Texts rolled in from parents asking if the roads were passable. I didn't answer, not out of spite, but because I'd been told to stop. Then the school bus arrived. I watched from the end of my driveway as it turned onto the main road, wheels already struggling. It made it 20 feet before sinking. The driver tried again, rocking back and forth, snow spraying uselessly. The bus stopped. Kids pressed their faces to the windows. Parents stepped outside, phones raised, confusion spreading. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, but even emergency vehicles couldn't get through. The HOA board started calling again. This time, their voices shook. They asked if I could help, just this once. I looked at the plow. I looked at the snow. And I remembered their words, effective immediately. Snow kept falling, quiet but heavy, erasing footprints as fast as they appeared. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, arguing, pointing, refreshing weather apps that only delivered worse news. Someone mentioned lawsuits. Someone else mentioned children. I said nothing. Inside, I felt the weight of responsibility collide with the certainty of having followed their command, without bending, without defiance, obedience and patience under a sky that refused mercy. That was the moment I knew this story wouldn't end quietly, and why you'll want to hear what happened next. By 9 o'clock, the storm had tightened its grip, and the quiet neighborhood turned restless. Parents paced driveways, stamping boots against snow, calling schools, calling each other, searching for answers that didn't exist. The bus sat stranded like a frozen monument, hazard lights blinking uselessly through thick snowfall, each flash amplifying the tension. The HOA board gathered in a panicked conference call. I know because my phone lit up again, message after message, tone completely changed. Where authority once stood, desperation now crept in. They didn't apologize. Not yet. They asked for temporary assistance and community cooperation, careful words meant to soften the damage they'd already done. I didn't respond. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was following instructions exactly as written. The ban was clear. No exceptions. No storm clause. No emergency language. They had drawn the line, and I stayed firmly behind it. Meanwhile, the school district dispatched a second bus, unaware of the situation. It never made it past the main road. Snow swallowed its tires almost immediately. Drivers radioed in warnings. Routes were suspended. Kids were sent back home, except those already stuck, waiting inside cold buses while engines idled and fuel ticked down. Police arrived next, then Public Works, but without plowed access, progress crawled. A tow truck attempted entry and failed. The storm didn't care about authority or rank. Snow kept falling, equal and relentless, flattening every plan beneath it. Neighbors began arguing openly. Some defended me, pointing out I'd always helped, always volunteered, always stepped up. Others blamed me outright, saying I should have ignored the HOA and plowed anyway. The divide widened with every passing minute. I stood at my window, watching a community fracture under pressure. I felt anger, yes, but also sadness. This didn't have to happen. One decision, made in a warm meeting room, had unraveled years of trust in a single morning. Around noon, the HOA president showed up in person, trudging through knee-deep snow to my driveway. She didn't knock at first. She just stood there, staring at the plow. When she finally looked up, her face was pale, lips tight, confidence gone. She asked me to reconsider. I asked her one question. Had the ban been lifted? She hesitated. That hesitation said everything. Snow muffled the world around us, heavy and unyielding, as consequences continued unfolding exactly as ordered. The HOA president shifted her weight in the snow, clearly unprepared for silence being used as leverage. She tried again, softer this time, saying the situation was bigger than rules now. I reminded her calmly that the rules were exactly what made it this big. She didn't like that answer. Behind her, the neighborhood looked unrecognizable. Cars sat buried, driveways vanished. The bus still hadn't moved, and parents hovered nearby, torn between worry and anger. Phones were recording now. Someone smelled a story. Someone always does. She finally admitted the board hadn't formally lifted the ban. They were working on it. I told her I couldn't move an inch without that in writing. Not because I wanted to watch things burn, but because once rules are ignored, they only matter when convenient. She walked away frustrated, boots dragging lines through snow that filled in seconds. By early afternoon, the storm intensified. Wind picked up, pushing snow sideways, erasing any attempt at progress. Emergency services pulled back, citing unsafe conditions. The bus driver was instructed to shelter in place until assistance could safely reach them. Parents were furious, kids were scared, and the HOA board was suddenly invisible. A group of neighbors approached me directly, bypassing the board entirely. They asked why I wouldn't just help. I explained everything, calmly, step by step. Some nodded in understanding. Others accused me of hiding behind paperwork while children suffered. That one stung, even though I knew the truth. What they didn't see were the emails, the warnings, the meetings where I'd begged the HOA to put contingency plans in place. They didn't hear the words, liability, and optics, tossed around like shields. They only saw the moment, not the buildup. Around 3 o'clock, something changed. A message went out to the entire neighborhood from the HOA account. Short, urgent, unusual. It announced an emergency board vote to temporarily suspend the snowplow ban due to unforeseen circumstances. Unforeseen. I read it twice. Minutes later, my phone rang. This time, it wasn't just the president. It was the entire board on speaker. Voices overlapped. Apologies began slipping through cracks in their authority. They confirmed the ban was lifted, effective immediately, pending review. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I walked to the garage, started the engine, and lowered the plow. As metal met snow, the sound cut through the storm like a reset button. Neighbors stepped back as I cleared a path, first to the bus, then down the street. Kids waved. Parents exhaled. The storm still raged, but momentum had shifted. What happened next would follow us long after the snow melted. The moment the plow blade scraped forward, something heavier than snow began to lift. Not relief, at least not yet, but tension that had settled into people's shoulders all day. I cleared a narrow lane first, just enough to free the bus. The driver eased forward slowly, tires gripping at last, parents stepping back as if afraid the moment might disappear. Children waved through fogged windows. Some parents cheered quietly, others avoided eye contact, embarrassed by how fast the narrative had shifted. Cameras were still out, but the tone changed. This wasn't chaos anymore, it was aftermath. I kept plowing, methodical and steady, pushing snow aside like it had personally offended me. Streets reappeared, curbs resurfaced. The neighborhood started to look like itself again, though something invisible had cracked beneath it. An hour later, the storm eased just enough for people to start talking. Not shouting, not blaming, talking. Neighbors gathered in driveways, replaying the day in fragments. Everyone had a version, everyone had a villain, and everyone agreed on one thing: this didn't have to happen. The HOA president tried to speak to me again once the immediate crisis passed. This time, she apologized. Not fully, not gracefully, but enough to acknowledge fault. She admitted the board acted hastily, reacting to one complaint about noise without considering consequences. She said they'd underestimated both the storm and the community's reliance on informal systems of help. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I asked her if the policy would change permanently. She said they'd discuss it at the next meeting. I told her discussions weren't enough anymore. That night, the story spread. Local groups picked it up first, then regional pages. Clips of the stuck bus, screenshots of HOA messages, short explanations stripped of nuance. Online, the reaction was explosive. Some people praised me, others tore me apart. The comment sections became battlegrounds for a larger argument about authority, responsibility, and common sense. What surprised me most was how many messages came from other neighborhoods. People who'd faced similar situations. HOAs banning ladders, generators, grills, until emergencies made rules feel absurd. They shared stories. They shared warnings. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Snow still lined the streets, but the room was heated in a different way. Residents demanded accountability. They demanded emergency clauses. They demanded humility. By the end of the meeting, the board voted unanimously to reinstate snowplowing permissions during storms, with written agreements and shared liability. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As I walked home under cleared streetlights, the silence felt earned. The snow had stopped. The lesson hadn't. The days after the storm felt strangely heavier than the storm itself. Snowbanks lingered like reminders, piled high at corners, slowly shrinking but refusing to disappear quickly. Every time I drove past the bus stop, I remembered the fear on parents' faces and the sound of spinning tires. The neighborhood looked normal again, but trust doesn't melt as easily as snow. People started stopping me during walks, at mailboxes, in parking lots. Some thanked me quietly, almost guiltily. Others asked why I didn't push back harder earlier, why I let it reach that point. I told them the same thing every time. I tried. Warnings only work when someone is willing to hear them. The HOA board sent out a long email explaining their decision, full of formal language and careful phrasing. They framed it as a learning experience, a rare alignment of unfortunate circumstances. Missing from the message was the human cost of that morning. No mention of cold buses, scared kids, or neighbors stranded. That omission bothered me more than the ban itself. A week later, I was invited to speak at a community forum about emergency preparedness. I almost declined. I'm not a speaker. I don't enjoy attention. But something told me this was bigger than my comfort. So I went. Standing in front of familiar faces, I laid everything out. Not angrily, not emotionally, just honestly. I explained how informal systems, neighbors helping neighbors, often fill gaps that policies ignore. I talked about how rules written for calm days can become dangerous during crises. And I reminded them that authority without flexibility doesn't protect anyone. The room was quiet when I finished. Then someone clapped. Then more followed. Not because I was right, but because the truth had finally landed. After that, things began to shift. The HOA formed an emergency committee made up of residents, not just board members. They consulted local responders. They created clear exceptions for storms, medical access, and power outages. For the first time, decisions felt grounded in reality instead of theory. I kept plowing, but differently now. With agreements in place, with shared responsibility, with fewer assumptions. And every time I started the engine, I remembered how close we'd come to something much worse than inconvenience. The story kept circulating online, morphing with each retelling. Some versions painted me as a hero, others as a villain. The truth sat somewhere quieter, less exciting, but more important. This was about listening before consequences forced the lesson. Winter didn't end that day. It never does. But something fundamental changed in our neighborhood. When the next storm came, no one questioned the plow. They just waved. And this time, the roads were ready. Spring arrived slowly, almost cautiously, as if the season itself wasn't sure it was welcome yet. Patches of snow clung to shaded corners, stubborn reminders of what had happened. Life moved on, but conversations kept circling back to that storm, replaying it like a shared memory that refused to fade. What surprised me most was how the story kept opening doors I never expected. A nearby town invited me to a council meeting after hearing about the incident. They were debating restrictions on private snow removal and wanted real-world perspective. Sitting in that room, I realized our neighborhood wasn't an exception. It was a preview. Officials talked about risk, liability, and control. I talked about time, about minutes lost when roads aren't cleared, about how emergencies don't wait for votes or emails. Some nodded, some took notes, a few looked uncomfortable. That's usually how you know something matters. Back home, the HOA Emergency Committee actually started working. They ran drills. They mapped priority routes. They identified residents with equipment, medical training, or access needs. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest effort, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, the school bus driver stopped by my house. He thanked me for coming back when I did. He admitted he'd been scared that day, more than he let on. When you're responsible for other people's children, every wrong turn feels heavier. We stood there quietly for a moment, understanding something without saying it out loud. Online, the attention eventually shifted to the next outrage. That's how it always goes. But a few messages stayed with me. Parents saying they'd joined their HOA boards after watching the video. Volunteers organizing emergency response teams. People realizing that rules should serve communities, not trap them. The next winter came early. Forecasts predicted another major storm, maybe worse than the last. This time, there were no frantic calls, no last-minute meetings. The HOA sent one clear message: plowing authorized, full cooperation requested. Neighbors checked on each other. Coffee appeared in travel mugs at dawn. It felt different. As I cleared the first street, the plow cutting clean lines through fresh snow, I thought about how close we'd come to learning the wrong lesson. About how easy it would have been to turn bitterness into identity. Instead, something quieter had grown: awareness. The bus rolled through on schedule, yellow against white, steady and safe. Kids waved like before, but now it felt lighter. Earned. I'm not naive. I know this won't fix every power struggle or prevent every bad decision. But I also know this: communities remember moments like that storm. They carry them forward, shaping choices in ways policies alone never can. Snow will always fall again. The question is whether we're ready to face it together, or repeat the same mistakes. By the time the second winter settled in fully, the storm that started everything had taken on a life of its own. People told the story differently now. Some exaggerated, some softened it, but the core remained unchanged. A decision made without foresight had forced an entire community to confront its priorities. And that confrontation lingered. What changed most wasn't policy. It was attitude. HOA meetings stopped being echo chambers. Questions were sharper. Assumptions were challenged. People who never spoke before raised hands and asked what plans existed beyond paperwork. Silence no longer felt acceptable. I noticed it in small ways. Neighbors shared weather alerts in group chats instead of complaints. Someone organized a volunteer phone tree for seniors during storms. Another mapped which houses had generators. None of this was ordered. It simply happened, born from collective memory. One evening, a new family moved in down the street. They asked about the HOA, nervous, having heard stories elsewhere. Instead of rehearsed warnings, people gave honest answers. It's not perfect, someone said, but it listens now. That felt like progress. The board eventually asked me to formally join the emergency committee. I hesitated. Authority had never been my goal. But refusing felt like stepping away from responsibility when it finally meant something. So I agreed, on one condition: decisions would be made with residents present, not behind closed doors. They accepted. We worked through scenarios together. Ice storms, medical emergencies, power failures, school delays. Each discussion peeled back another layer of how fragile systems can be when they rely too heavily on control and not enough on cooperation. It wasn't dramatic work, but it was necessary. What stayed with me most, though, were the kids. The ones on the bus that day. Months later, one of them left a note in my mailbox, written in uneven handwriting, thanking me for fixing the road. I stood there longer than I expected, reading it again, thinking about how close we'd come to letting pride override responsibility. Online, the video resurfaced occasionally, usually when another HOA story went wrong. Comment sections filled with familiar arguments. But sometimes, buried between outrage and jokes, were thoughtful reflections. People asking how to balance rules with humanity. Those were the comments that mattered. Looking back, I don't see a villain anymore. I see fear, masked as authority. I see systems built to prevent chaos accidentally creating it. And I see how quickly things can unravel when empathy is replaced by procedure. The storm didn't make us better people overnight, but it gave us a reference point. A reminder etched into memory like tire tracks frozen in snow. And that reminder would be tested sooner than anyone expected. The test came quietly, not with sirens or headlines, but with a forecast most people almost ignored. Freezing rain overnight, followed by a sudden temperature drop. Not dramatic, not rare, the kind of weather that slips past attention until it turns roads into glass. This time, the response was different from the very beginning. Before midnight, messages went out. Volunteers checked in. Salt supplies were staged. I received a simple text from the HOA chair, plowing approved. Do what you think is best. No bylaws attached. No conditions. Just trust. I went out before dawn. The rain had already frozen solid, coating everything in a deceptive shine. Trees glittered. Power lines hummed faintly. It was beautiful in the way danger sometimes is. As I worked, I noticed headlights behind me, neighbors following slowly, spreading salt, checking intersections. No one was ordered to be there. They showed up because they remembered what happened when nobody did. Around 7, an ambulance needed access to a side street. The driver waved when he passed, relief visible even through the windshield. That moment alone justified every uncomfortable conversation that came before it. The school bus rolled through without incident. No stuck tires, no panic, just another morning, exactly the way it should be. Parents waved, coffee in hand, jackets zipped against the cold. Ordinary felt extraordinary. Later that day, the emergency committee met briefly, not to react, but to review. What worked? What didn't? What could be improved? No blame, no defensiveness, just adjustment. It felt like adulthood, honestly. That evening, I sat in the garage, engine ticking as it cooled, thinking about how fragile this balance still was. One bad board election, one loud complaint, one forgotten lesson. Systems have short memories. People don't, unless they're pushed to forget. I thought about the first storm again. The bus, the kids, the silence after the engine shut off. That moment still lived somewhere deep, not as anger, but as clarity. It reminded me that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good in the moment, and that patience can be louder than protest. Messages came in from other neighborhoods asking how we changed things. I told them the truth. There was no shortcut. Just consequences, reflection, and willingness to sit with discomfort long enough for learning to happen. That night, freezing rain tapped lightly against the windows, harmless now. Roads stayed open, power stayed on, life continued. Nothing went viral, nothing broke, and that was the victory. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because understanding a lesson and keeping it are two very different things. By the time winter finally released its grip, the storm that once defined our neighborhood had become something quieter, almost symbolic. Not a warning shouted anymore, but a marker, before and after. People didn't talk about the snow as much as they talked about what it revealed when everything else was stripped away. The HOA elections that spring were the most attended in memory. Not because of drama, but because people cared. New board members were chosen carefully, less for confidence and more for judgment. The bylaws were revised, not rewritten to control, but rewritten to allow flexibility when real life demanded it. Words like emergency discretion and community coordination replaced rigid clauses that once looked good only on paper. I stepped back from the spotlight after that, not out of bitterness, but because the goal was never attention. The real success was that I wasn't needed in the same way anymore. Systems existed now, communication flowed, responsibility was shared instead of outsourced to whoever happened to own the right equipment. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, I'd see kids from the bus walking home after school, laughing, backpacks dragging in the snow or rain. They had no idea how close that routine had come to breaking. And that was exactly how it should be. Stability is invisible when it works. The video still surfaced now and then, usually framed as HOA karma or instant backfire. People wanted a villain, a punchline, a winner. I never corrected them. The truth was more complicated and less satisfying to argue about online. Real change rarely fits cleanly into captions. What stayed with me was a simple realization: following rules blindly can be just as dangerous as ignoring them completely. Wisdom lives in the space between. In asking questions. In pausing long enough to see who might be affected by a decision made too quickly. The snowplow sits in my garage now, scratched, reliable, waiting. It doesn't represent defiance to me anymore. It represents readiness, a reminder that tools are only as useful as the judgment guiding them. When the first flakes fall each year, people don't panic. They prepare. They check on neighbors. They trust each other a little more than before. That trust was earned the hard way, but earned nonetheless. If there's one thing I hope viewers take from this story, it's not about HOAs or snow or buses. It's about listening, especially when it's inconvenient. Because the cost of ignoring reality is always higher than the cost of adapting to it. Snow will fall again. Rules will be tested again. But next time, this community won't be caught standing still, waiting for permission to do the right thing. And that, more than anything, is what made walking away worth it.